Hi everyone, my name is Carmen, and I'm 58 years old. I've been married to my husband Miguel for 32 years, and we have 2 grown sons, Antonio, who's 29, and Carlos, who's 26. Let me tell you, raising those boys wasn't easy, especially when Miguel was working double shifts at the construction company just to keep food on the table. You know what kept us going through those tough years? My cooking. I learned everything from my grandmother Rosa, who came here from Mexico with nothing but her recipes and her determination. She taught me that food isn't just about filling stomachs. It's about keeping families together, preserving our culture, and showing love in every single bite. For 30 years, I sacrificed everything for my family. While other women my age were building careers, I was perfecting my mole recipe at 4 a.m. before heading to my part-time job at the grocery store. While they were going to book clubs and spa days, I was canning salsas and preparing elaborate Sunday dinners that brought the whole extended family together. But you know what? I never complained, not once, because seeing my family's faces light up when they tasted my food, that was worth everything. When Antonio met Isabella 3 years ago, I was thrilled. Finally, a daughter I never had. She was this petite, energetic woman with these big, ambitious dreams, and she seemed to genuinely love my son. More importantly, she seemed to love my cooking. "Carmen," she'd say, batting her long eyelashes, "your tamales are absolutely incredible. I've never tasted anything like them." Every Sunday dinner, she'd be there with her phone, taking pictures of every dish. "For Instagram," she'd laugh. "My followers are obsessed with authentic Mexican food." I should have seen the red flags then, but I was just so happy to have someone who appreciated what I did. The requests started innocently enough. About 6 months after they got engaged, Isabella pulled me aside after dinner. "Carmen, would you mind teaching me how to make your pozole? Antonio loves it so much and I want to surprise him." Of course I said yes. What mother-in-law wouldn't want to share her recipes with her future daughter-in-law? This was exactly what I dreamed of, passing down my grandmother's legacy to the next generation. We spent the next Saturday together in my kitchen. I showed her every step, from selecting the right hominy to the secret blend of chilies that made my pozole different from everyone else's. She took notes frantically, asked all the right questions, and even helped me clean up afterward. "You're such an amazing cook, Carmen," she said, giving me this warm hug. "Antonio is so lucky to have grown up with this food." That became our thing. Every few weeks, Isabella would ask to learn another recipe. My carnitas, my chile en nogada, my tres leches cake that Miguel always said was better than his own mother's. And trust me, that woman could bake. I was in heaven. Finally, someone who truly appreciated the time and love that went into each dish. Someone who understood that these weren't just recipes. They were our family's history, written in flavors and techniques passed down through generations. But wait, this is where things start getting weird, and trust me, you're not going to believe what happens next. Isabella started asking very specific questions. Not just how much cumin do you use, but exactly how long do you toast the chilies, and what's the precise temperature for frying the chicken. She'd measure everything with this little digital scale she brought over, writing down measurements to the gram. "I want to make sure I get it exactly right," she'd explain. "I don't want to mess up your grandmother's recipes." I thought it was sweet, thorough, professional even. Then she started asking about my suppliers. Where did I get my special chilies? Which market had the best meat? What brand of Mexican crema did I prefer? "I want to make sure I'm using the same quality ingredients you do," she'd say. I gave her everything. Contact information for my meat supplier, who'd been serving our family for 15 years. The little import shop where I bought my authentic spices. Even introduced her to Maria, who sold the most incredible fresh tortillas at the farmer's market. Looking back now, I feel so stupid. But at the time, I just saw a young woman who wanted to take care of my son the same way I'd taken care of my family all these years. The wedding was beautiful. Isabella looked stunning, and Antonio couldn't stop smiling. During the reception, she made this speech about how grateful she was to join our family and how she promised to carry on our traditions. Carmen has taught me so much about love, family, and the importance of sharing meals together, she said, looking right at me with tears in her eyes. I promise to honor everything she shared with me, I cried. Miguel cried. Hell, even my stoic father-in-law got a little misty-eyed. For the first year of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. Isabella would host little dinner parties, showing off her new cooking skills to their friends. She'd always make sure to mention that she'd learned everything from her amazing mother-in-law. But then things started changing. About 8 months ago, Isabella mentioned that she and Antonio was thinking about opening a restaurant. She'd always dreamed of having her own business, and Antonio had some money saved up from his job at the tech company. We're thinking of doing authentic Mexican cuisine, she told me over coffee one afternoon. Really traditional stuff, you know? The kind of food that tells a story. I was excited. A restaurant in the family. I started imagining Sunday dinners there, bringing the grandkids, when they eventually came along, to eat at their parents' place. That sounds wonderful, mija, I told her. If you need any help with recipes or anything. Oh, Carmen, she laughed. You've already taught me so much. I think we've got it covered. That should have been my second red flag. But I just figured she wanted to make it on her own, you know? Show her independence. They found this perfect little space downtown, right in the arts district where all the young professionals went for lunch. Isabella was there every day, overseeing the renovation, picking out tables and chairs, designing the menu. She never asked for my input, not once. We wanted to be a surprise, Antonio explained when I asked if I could come see the place. Isabella's got this whole vision, and she wants to reveal it all at once. 3 months later, they had their grand opening. Corazón Mexicano, Mexican heart. The name was beautiful, I'll give her that. But here's where this story takes a turn that's going to make your blood boil. Isabella invited the whole family to the opening night. We arrived to find a line around the block. Apparently, her social media marketing had worked perfectly. The restaurant was gorgeous, with these warm yellow walls covered in traditional Talavera tiles and strings of papel picado fluttering from the ceiling. But the moment I walked in, my heart stopped. The smell hit me first, that exact combination of toasted chilies, cumin, and garlic that I'd perfected over 30 years. Then I saw the menu board, written in beautiful chalk calligraphy. Abuela Rosa's famous mole, 24, traditional pozole rojo, 18 carnitas de la casa, 22 chili and desmadei, nogada especial, 26 my grandmother's mole, my pozole, my carnitas, my chili and nogada that took me 4 hours to make from scratch. And the prices? Jesus Christ, $24 for a plate of mole? I could feed my entire family for that much. But wait, it gets worse. So much worse. I walked up to Isabella, who was greeting customers like some kind of celebrity chef, wearing this beautiful embroidered apron that looked suspiciously similar to the one my grandmother had given me. Isabella, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. These recipes, they look familiar. She turned to me with this bright, fake smile. Oh, Carmen, aren't you proud? We're bringing authentic Mexican cuisine to the community. But these are my recipes, my grandmother's recipes. Her smile never wavered. Well, they're traditional recipes, Carmen. No one owns them. This is cultural food. I felt like I'd been slapped. Cultural food? These weren't generic recipes from some cookbook. These were specific techniques, specific ingredient combinations that my family had developed and refined over generations. The mole alone had 17 different ingredients. each toasted and blended in a very particular way that I'd learned from my grandmother, who'd learned from hers. The chile en nogada used a secret ingredient, a tiny bit of cinnamon in the walnut sauce, that I'd never seen in any other recipe. Isabella, I started, but she'd already turned away to greet another customer. Antonio appeared at my elbow. "Mom, isn't this incredible? Isabella's been working so hard on this." "Son," I said quietly, "these are our family recipes." He looked confused. "Mom, they're just Mexican food. It's not like Isabella invented tacos, you know?" That's when I realized that my own son didn't understand what his wife had done. He didn't see the difference between generic Mexican food and the specific cherished recipes that had been passed down through our family. I spent the rest of that evening watching strangers eat my grandmother's food, paying premium prices for dishes that Isabella was presenting as her own creations. The waiters described each dish with little stories. Our chef learned this mole recipe from an ancient grandmother in Mexico. That were my stories, told as if Isabella had lived them herself. But you know what the worst part was? The food was perfect. Every single dish tasted exactly like mine, because they were mine. I went home that night and cried for 3 hours straight. Miguel tried to comfort me, but he didn't really understand either. "Carmen, maybe you should be flattered," he said. "She learned from the best." Flattered. Over the next few weeks, I watched from social media as Corazon Mexicano became the hottest restaurant in town. Food bloggers were raving about Isabella's authentic family recipes and her intuitive understanding of traditional Mexican flavors. One review particularly stung. "Chef Isabella brings a level of authenticity to Mexican cuisine that's rare in this city. Each dish tells a story of tradition and family heritage that you can literally taste. My family heritage, my stories." I decided I needed to have a conversation with Isabella, a real conversation, away from the restaurant and my son. I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. She agreed, though she sounded a bit hesitant. We met at this little cafe near my house, the same place where we used to chat about recipes and family traditions back when I thought she genuinely cared about both. "Isabella," I started carefully, "I need to talk to you about the restaurant." "Isn't it amazing?" she interrupted, her eyes lighting up. "We're booked solid for the next month. The food critics are saying we're going to be featured in the City magazine's Best New Restaurants issue." That's wonderful," I said. "But I'm concerned about something. The recipes you're using, they're very specific to my family." Her expression changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder. "Carmen, I told you before, these are traditional recipes. They belong to the culture, not to any one person. But Isabella, you didn't learn these from an ancient grandmother in Mexico like your waiters are telling people. You learned them from me, in my kitchen, using my ingredients and my techniques." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I never claimed I learned them from anyone in Mexico." "Your staff is literally telling customers that." "I can't control every word my servers say, Carmen. Look, I'm grateful that you taught me to cook, I really am. But you can't expect me to give you credit for every single dish we serve." I stared at her. This was not the same woman who'd hugged me and promised to carry on our family traditions. "I'm not asking for credit," I said quietly. "I'm asking for recognition. These recipes, they're not just food to me, Isabella. They're my grandmother's legacy. They're what kept my family together through some very hard times." She sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "Carmen, you're being too emotional about this. Food is food. If the recipes work for our business, then that's great for everyone. Too emotional? About my grandmother's legacy? About recipes that represented 30 years of my life? What if—" I started, then stopped. I was about to suggest that maybe the restaurant could mention that some recipes were inspired by family traditions, or even just acknowledge where she'd learned them. but looking at her face, I realized there was no point. This wasn't the Isabella I thought I knew. This was someone who saw my family's history as ingredients for her success story. "You know what, Isabella?" I said, standing up. "You're right. Food is food." She looked relieved. "I'm so glad you understand, Carmen. I was worried this might be awkward between us." Awkward. That's what she called stealing my family's recipes and profiting from them while erasing my existence from the story. But I just smiled and nodded. "Of course, mija. Family is family, right?" Over the next month, I tried to make peace with the situation. I really did. I told myself that maybe Isabella was right. Maybe I was being too sentimental. Maybe I should just be happy that my recipes were making people happy, even if I wasn't getting any recognition for them. I even started going to the restaurant occasionally, just to see how things were going. Isabella was always polite but distant, treating me like any other customer rather than the woman who taught her everything she knew. But then something happened that changed everything. It was a busy Friday night, about 6 weeks after the grand opening. I'd decided to bring my sister Teresa and her husband for dinner. They'd been curious about all the buzz surrounding the restaurant. We waited 45 minutes for a table, which was fine. I was actually proud, in a weird way, watching people line up to eat food based on my recipes. When we were finally seated, our server, a young guy named David, was incredibly enthusiastic about the menu. "You have to try the mole," he told us. "It's our signature dish. Chef Isabella learned the recipe from her grandmother in Guadalajara. It takes her 8 hours to make the sauce from scratch." I almost choked on my water. Her grandmother in Guadalajara? Isabella was from Phoenix, and her grandmother, H., who I'd met several times, had been born in Nebraska. 8 hours? My sister asked, impressed. "Oh yes," David continued. "Chef Isabella is completely dedicated to authenticity. She spent years learning traditional techniques from indigenous cooks in Mexico." That was it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about using my recipes. Isabella was creating an entire fictional backstory for herself, positioning herself as some kind of culinary explorer who discovered these ancient secrets through her own adventures. My adventures, my grandmother's story, my years of perfecting these dishes. But I sat there quietly, ordered the mole, my own mole, and ate it while listening to my sister praise Isabella's incredible talent and authentic approach to Mexican cuisine. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and I made a decision. If Isabella wanted to play the game of erasing my existence from my own family's food story, then maybe it was time for me to remind everyone where these recipes really came from. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I started making phone calls, but first, let me tell you about what happened the following week, because this is where Isabella showed her true colors in a way that's going to make you absolutely furious. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I decided to stop by the restaurant during the slow period between lunch and dinner. I wanted to talk to Isabella again, maybe try to find some middle ground. I walked in around 3 p.m. when there were only a couple of customers finishing their meals. Isabella was behind the bar, going over receipts or something. "Hi, Isabella," I said, approaching cautiously. She looked up, and for just a second, I saw something flash across her face. Annoyance, guilt, I couldn't tell. "Oh, hi, Carmen. What brings you by?" I was wondering if we could talk. Maybe find a way to work together on this restaurant thing. I know you're busy, but I have so many more recipes that might... Actually, Carmen, she interrupted, glancing around nervously, "I need to ask you something." She led me to a corner booth, away from the other customers. "Look," she said, sitting across from me. "I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I think it might be better if you didn't come here as often." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Well, some of the customers have been asking questions about who you are, why you're here so much. And when I explained that you're my mother-in-law, Well, it creates this awkward situation where they start asking about the recipes and where they came from. My heart started pounding. And that's bad? It's just complicated, you know? For the business, people want to believe in the story we're telling about the food. When there's this other narrative floating around, she shrugged. It dilutes the brand. My existence diluted her brand. So you're asking me not to come to your restaurant. I'm asking you to be considerate of what we're trying to build here. Maybe just give us some space to establish ourselves before you start coming around regularly. I sat there in stunned silence. This woman, who I'd welcomed into my family, who I'd taught my most precious recipes, who I'd treated like the daughter I never had, was asking me to stay away from a restaurant built entirely on my family's food because my presence was inconvenient for her business. Isabella, I said quietly, do you understand what you're asking me? I'm asking you to support your son's business by being strategic about when and how you visit. Strategic, like I was some kind of PR problem to be managed. And what about Antonio? Does he know you're asking me this? She shifted uncomfortably. Antonio understands that running a restaurant is complicated. He wants what's best for the business. That was the moment I realized that my daughter-in-law wasn't just stealing my recipes. She was systematically erasing me from my own family story, and she was getting my son to go along with it. I stood up from that booth, looked her straight in the eye and said, "You know what, Isabella? You're absolutely right. I should be more strategic." She looked relieved. "I'm so glad you understand, Carmen." "Oh, I understand perfectly." I walked out of that restaurant, got in my car, and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, shaking with rage. Then I drove straight home and made the first of many phone calls that were about to change everything. Because you know what? If Isabella wanted to play hardball with my family's legacy, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. But wait until you hear what I discovered when I started making those calls. What I found out about Isabella's business plan is going to blow your mind. The first call I made was to my cousin Esperanza, who works in the city's business licensing department. I figured if Isabella wanted to play the business game, I should understand the rules. "Esperanza, I need a favor," I said. "Can you look up information about a restaurant called Corazon Mexicano?" 20 minutes later, she called me back with information that made my blood run cold. "Carmen, this is interesting. The business license was filed 8 months ago, way before they announced they were opening a restaurant. And get this, the initial application listed the business as traditional Mexican cuisine, featuring authentic family recipes passed down through generations. 8 months ago. That was right around the time Isabella had started asking me those very specific questions about measurements and suppliers. "There's more," Esperanza continued. "They applied for a trademark on several recipe names, including something called Abuela Rosa's famous mole." I nearly dropped the phone. They were trying to trademark my grandmother's name. "My grandmother's name? Can they do that?" I asked. "Well, if no one challenges it within the specified period, and if they can prove they're the original creators or have rights to use it." She paused. "Carmen, did you give them permission to use your grandmother's name?" "Hell no, I didn't give them permission." That's when I realized this wasn't just opportunistic theft. This was a planned, calculated business strategy. Isabella hadn't fallen in love with my cooking and decided to use the recipes on a whim. She'd identified a target, my family's food legacy, and systematically extracted everything she needed to build her business around it. The second call I made was to my nephew Roberto, who works in digital marketing. If Isabella was using social media to build her brand on my family's story, I needed to understand exactly what she was saying. "Tia Carmen, I pulled up all their social media accounts," Roberto told me an hour later. "This woman has been telling some serious lies." He read me post after post where Isabella described learning recipes from indigenous grandmothers in remote Mexican villages and talked about her years of culinary study in traditional Mexican kitchens. She'd created this whole elaborate backstory about traveling through Mexico, learning ancient techniques from elderly women who'd trusted her with their family secrets. But Tia, Roberto said, here's the really messed up part. I found some older posts from before the restaurant opened. She was posting pictures of food with captions like, learning from the best. My amazing mother-in-law Carmen is teaching me authentic family recipes. But guess what? She deleted all those posts after the restaurant opened. She'd systematically erased any evidence that she'd learned these recipes from me. The social media trail told a clear story of deliberate deception. The third call I made was to Maria, my friend who sold tortillas at the farmer's market. Isabella had been buying from her for months, and I wanted to know what she'd been telling her. Ay, Carmen, Maria said. I was wondering when you'd call. That girl has been coming here every week, buying tortillas for her restaurant. She always tells people that she learned about authentic ingredients from her travels in Mexico, but... Maria lowered her voice. She asked me to never mention that you introduced us. Said it would complicate her business story. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. Isabella hadn't just stolen my recipes. She'd gone to every single person I'd introduced her to and asked them to hide my involvement in her culinary education. This was a level of betrayal I hadn't even imagined. But you know what? I wasn't done investigating, because I had a feeling there was more to this story. And I was right. I called my friend Linda, who worked at the bank where Isabella and Antonio had gotten their business loan. Now Linda couldn't give me confidential information, but she could. Tell me things that were public record. Carmen, honey, I remember that loan application, Linda said carefully. The interesting thing was how she presented the business concept. She had this whole portfolio of proprietary recipes that she claimed would set the restaurant apart from competitors. Proprietary recipes. My recipes were listed as her proprietary intellectual property. Did she mention where the recipes came from? I asked. She said they were family recipes that had been passed down to her. She even brought in this little notebook, all handwritten, that she said was her grandmother's recipe collection. I knew that notebook. It was the one Isabella had been writing in during all our cooking sessions. The one where she'd recorded every single technique, every measurement, every secret ingredient I'd shared with her. That's when something clicked in my brain. A memory from about a year ago, when Isabella had been over for Sunday dinner. She'd complimented my grandmother's old recipe box, this beautiful wooden box with hand-painted flowers that sat on my kitchen counter. I'd told her the story of how my grandmother had brought it from Mexico, how it contained all the original recipe cards written in her careful script. It's so beautiful, Isabella had said, like a piece of living history. The next week, she'd shown up with an almost identical box. Same style, same hand-painted flowers. I found this at an antique shop, she'd said. It reminded me of your grandmother's box. I thought I could use it to store the recipes you're teaching me. Now I realized what she'd been doing. She wasn't just copying my recipes. She was creating physical evidence to support her fictional backstory. That notebook Linda had seen wasn't just a collection of stolen recipes. It was part of an elaborate prop designed to convince lenders and investors that Isabella had legitimate claim to these recipes. This woman had been playing a long game, and I'd been the perfect mark, trusting, generous, eager to share my knowledge with someone I thought cared about preserving family traditions. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated exactly what kind of woman she was dealing with. See, Isabella thought she knew me. She saw a middle-aged Mexican woman who'd spent her life in the kitchen, someone who could be politely pushed aside once her usefulness was over. What she didn't know was that before I became a full-time mother and wife, I'd worked my way up to assistant manager at the grocery store by being smarter, tougher, and more strategic than anyone expected. I'd just been out of practice for 30 years. Time to dust off those skills. The first thing I did was document everything. I took photos of every single recipe card in my grandmother's collection. The original cards in her handwriting dated decades before Isabella was even born. I made copies of every photo I had of family gatherings where I was cooking these dishes, going back 20 years. Then I called my lawyer, Jim Rodriguez, who'd handled my mother's estate a few years back. Jim, I need to understand intellectual property law as it relates to family recipes. What I learned was fascinating. While you can't copyright basic recipes, you can protect specific techniques, unique combinations of ingredients, and proprietary methods, especially if you can prove they're original to your family and have been kept secret. More importantly, you can definitely challenge someone who's using false claims about the origin of recipes for commercial gain. Carmen? Jim said, if you can prove that she knowingly made false statements about the source of these recipes in her business applications, loan documents, or marketing materials, that's fraud. And if she's trying to trademark your grandmother's name without rights to it, that's trademark infringement. But legal action would take years and cost money I didn't have. I needed a faster, more direct approach. That's when I remembered something. My grandmother used to say, Mia, when someone steals your thunder, you don't chase them down. You make better thunder. It was time to make some thunder. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about the restaurant business. I talked to suppliers, visited other Mexican restaurants, and researched commercial kitchen requirements. I even took a weekend seminar on food service licensing and permits. Isabella thought she'd cornered the market on authentic Mexican food in our neighborhood. She was about to learn that there's a big difference between authentic and original. The location I found was perfect. A small space that had previously housed a cafe, just 3 blocks from Corazon Mexicano. It had a full commercial kitchen that just needed some updating, and the rent was surprisingly affordable because the previous tenant had left suddenly. But here's the beautiful part. The space was right across the street from the farmer's market where Maria sold her tortillas. The same farmer's market that Isabella visited every week. The same one where she'd asked Maria to hide my involvement in her education. I could practically see Isabella's restaurant from the front window. I signed the lease using money from the savings account Miguel and I had been building for retirement. When I told him what I was planning, he thought I'd lost my mind. Carmen, you've never run a restaurant. You don't know the first thing about the business side. Miguel, I said, I've been feeding people for 30 years. The only difference now is that they're going to pay me for it. But I wasn't going into this blind. I spent every day for 3 weeks working in the kitchen of my friend Rosa's small restaurant, learning the practical side of commercial cooking. How to scale recipes for large quantities. How to manage inventory. How to price dishes properly. Rosa was intrigued by my plan. You know, Carmen, I've been thinking about retiring. What if instead of competing with each other, we worked together? That's how Abuela Rosa's kitchen became a partnership. Rosa handled the business management and front of house operations. I handled the kitchen and menu development. Together we had 60 years of combined experience feeding people. But more importantly, we had something Isabella would never have: authenticity. While Isabella was serving my recipes and telling lies about learning them from indigenous grandmothers, I was going to serve the same recipes with their real story. The story of my actual grandmother, Rosa, who really had brought these techniques from Mexico. The story of 3 generations of women who preserved and perfected these recipes through decades of family meals. Every dish was going to come with its true history. The menu I designed was strategically brilliant, if I do say so myself. I included every single recipe that Isabella was serving at Corazon Mexicano, but I priced them 30% lower and improved each one with techniques I'd never taught her. Remember that secret ingredient in my chile en nogada, the tiny bit of cinnamon in the walnut sauce? I'd never mentioned it to Isabella. Her version was good, but mine was still better. The mold that took me 30 years to perfect. I taught Isabella the base recipe, but there were 3 additional steps, including a final touch of chocolate and a whisper of coffee, that I'd never shared with anyone. My pozole had a depth of flavor that came from using 3 different types of dried chilies in very specific proportions. Isabella knew about 2 of them. Every single dish on my menu was going to be recognizably similar to what she was serving, but noticeably better. But the real genius was in the storytelling. Where Isabella's menu said Abuela Rosa's famous mole, mine said Abuela Rosa's original mole, created by my grandmother Rosa Hernandez in 1952, perfected over 70 years in our family kitchen. Where hers said traditional pozole rojo, mine said pozole rojo, Rosa's Sunday recipe. This is the actual recipe my grandmother brought from Guadalajara in 1948, served every Sunday for 3 generations. Every dish had a real story with real dates, real names, and real family photos on the walls to prove it. The renovation took 6 weeks. Every day, I watched Isabella through the window as she walked to the farmer's market, completely oblivious to what was happening right under her nose. Rosa and I worked 16-hour days getting everything ready. We painted murals on the walls showing scenes from my grandmother's life. We hung family photos dating back to the 1940s. We created a display case with my grandmother's actual recipe cards, her original molcajete, and the wooden spoon she'd used for 50 years. It was like building a shrine to the real story that Isabella had tried to erase. 3 days before our opening, I did something that I'm still proud of. I made a list of every food blogger, restaurant critic, and local influencer who'd written about Corazón Mexicano. Then I sent each of them a personal invitation to our opening, along with a packet that included photos of my grandmother's original recipe cards. Family photos showing me cooking these dishes over the past 30 years, a timeline showing the real history of each recipe, a copy of Isabella's social media posts where she'd originally credited me as her teacher. Roberto had managed to recover them from cached versions. The invitation read, "Come taste the difference between authentic and original. Come hear the real story behind the recipes that have made Corazón Mexicano famous." I also invited every single person from my extended family, everyone from church, all my neighbors, and everyone who'd ever complimented my cooking over the past 30 years. But the invitation I was most excited to send was the one addressed to Isabella and Antonio. "Dear Isabella and Antonio," I wrote, "you're cordially invited to the grand opening of Abuela Rosa's kitchen, featuring the original recipes that have been in our family for over 70 years. Come see where the story really began." Opening day was a Saturday. I arrived at 5 a.m. to start the prep work, and I've never been more nervous in my life. What if nobody came? What if the food wasn't good enough? What if Isabella was right and I was just being a sentimental old woman? But by 10 a.m., there was already a line outside. The first customers were my family, of course. My sister Teresa, my cousins, my neighbors from church. But then came people I didn't recognize. Food bloggers with cameras, young couples who'd clearly heard about the opening on social media, even some of the customers I'd seen at Corazón Mexicano. The food was perfect. Every dish came out exactly as I'd imagined it. But more than that, every customer could taste the difference. The mole was richer, more complex. The pozole had layers of flavor that Isabella's version lacked. The chile en nogada was transcendent. And the stories people were fascinated by, the real stories behind each dish. I'd hired local art students to act as servers, and I'd trained each of them on the actual history of our recipes. Instead of the vague, ancient grandmother nonsense that Isabella was peddling, our customers heard specific stories about specific people in specific times and places. This mole recipe was created by Rosa Hernandez in 1952 when she was trying to recreate her mother's recipe from memory after coming to America. It took her 3 years to get it right, and she passed it down to her granddaughter Carmen, who's been making it for her family every Christmas for 30 years. People ate it up, literally and figuratively. By noon, we had a 2-hour wait for tables. By 2 p.m., we'd sold out of 3 different dishes. By evening, people were posting photos and reviews faster than I could keep track of. But the best part, around 3 p.m., I looked out the front window and saw Isabella standing across the street, staring at the line of customers waiting to get into my restaurant. She looked confused, then concerned, then absolutely furious. 20 minutes later, Antonio walked in. "Mom," he said, looking around at the packed restaurant. "What is this?" "This is Abuela Rosa's kitchen," I said calmly. "Would you like a table?" "Mom, you can't do this. You're competing with Isabella's restaurant." "No, Miko," I corrected him. "Isabella was competing with my recipes. I'm just giving people a chance to taste the originals." He looked uncomfortable. "This is going to cause problems in the family. The problem started when your wife stole my grandmother's recipes and then asked me to stay away from the restaurant she built with them," I said. "I'm just telling the true story. That evening, as we were closing up after the most successful day of my life, Isabella finally worked up the courage to come inside. She walked in right before closing time, when most of the customers had left. Her face was tight with anger. "Carmen, we need to talk." "Of course, mija. Would you like to try the mole? It's the original recipe." "You know exactly what I want to talk about. This." She gestured around the restaurant. "This is sabotage." "No, Isabella. This is competition. Isn't that what you said when you opened your restaurant using my recipes? That it's just business. Those recipes don't belong to you, Carmen. They're traditional Mexican recipes." I walked over to the display case and picked up one of my grandmother's original recipe cards. "This card is dated March 15, 1952, I said. "It's in my grandmother's handwriting. It shows the exact measurements and techniques for the mole you're serving at your restaurant. The same mole you learned to make in my kitchen 6 months ago." Isabella's face was getting red. "Anyone can write a date on a card, Carmen." "You're right," I agreed. "Anyone can. Just like anyone can make up stories about learning recipes from indigenous grandmothers in Mexico. But some of us have actual proof." I handed her a folder. Inside were copies of all the documentation I'd gathered. The photos, the timeline, the recovered social media posts, everything. "This is the real story, Isabella. The story you tried to erase when you decided I was inconvenient for your brand." She flipped through the papers, her hands shaking slightly. "What do you want, Carmen?" "I want you to tell the truth. I want you to stop claiming you learned these recipes from some fictional grandmother in Mexico. I want you to acknowledge where they really came from. And if I don't," I smiled, "then I guess we'll let the customers decide which story they believe. The one about the mysterious indigenous grandmothers who somehow taught you recipes that match my family's cards from the 1950s. Or the one about the real grandmother who actually created these dishes and passed them down to her granddaughter." Isabella left without saying another word. Over the next month, the battle between our restaurants played out in the most satisfying way possible. Every food blogger and critic who visited both restaurants came to the same conclusion. While Corazon Mexicano served good food, Abuela Rosa's kitchen served the same dishes but better, with more authentic stories and more reasonable prices. The City magazine's Best New Restaurants issue came out 3 weeks after my opening. Corazon Mexicano wasn't featured at all. Instead, there was a 2-page spread about Abuela Rosa's kitchen, with photos of my grandmother's recipe cards and a detailed story about how I'd preserved these family recipes for over 30 years. Safety. Article mentioned Corazon Mexicano, but only to note that while other restaurants in the area serve similar dishes, Abuela Rosa's kitchen offers the documented original versions of these recipes, along with their genuine family history. Isabella's social media engagement started dropping. People were commenting on her posts, asking about the connection to Abuela Rosa's kitchen, wanting to know the real story behind the recipes. She tried to fight back by posting about her authentic training in Mexico, but people weren't buying it anymore. Someone had posted side-by-side photos of her old social media posts, the ones where she'd credited me, and her new claims about learning from indigenous grandmothers. The internet doesn't forgive that kind of deception. Within 6 weeks of my opening, Corazon Mexicano's business had dropped by more than half. They went from having a wait list to having empty tables on weekend nights. But you know what the most satisfying moment was? It was 2 months after my opening, on a busy Saturday night. I was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on a plate of chile en nogada when Rosa came back to tell me that Isabella was at table 12. "She's alone," Rosa said, "and she's been sitting there for 20 minutes, just reading the menu." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out to her table. "Isabella," I said, "I'm surprised to see you here." She looked up at me and I could see that she'd been crying. "Carmen, I need to apologize." I sat down across from her. "I'm listening. I know what I did was wrong. I know I took advantage of your kindness and I know I hurt you. I've been watching what you've built here and I realize—" She took a shaky breath. "I realized that I never understood what those recipes meant to you." "To your family?" "No," I said quietly. "You didn't." "My restaurant is failing, Carmen. We're going to have to close next month." I'd heard the rumors, but hearing it confirmed didn't give me the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt something like sadness. "What about Antonio?" I asked. He's angry with me. He finally understands what I did, and he's angry that I put him in the position of having to choose between his wife and his mother." We sat in silence for a moment. "Carmen," she said finally, "is there any way we could work together? I know I don't deserve it, but maybe I could work here, learn the business the right way." I looked at this woman who'd tried to erase my existence from my own family's story, who'd stolen my recipes and built a business on lies about their origin. "Isabella," I said, "do you know why my restaurant is successful and yours is failing?" She shook her head. "It's not because my food is better, though it is. It's not because my prices are lower, though they are. It's because people can taste the difference between food made with love and respect for its history and food made purely for profit." I leaned forward. "When you cook my grandmother's mole, you're just following a recipe. When I cook it, I'm honoring her memory, connecting with my family's history, and sharing something that has been passed down through generations of women who understood that food is about more than just feeding people." Isabella was crying openly. "Now, I could teach you to cook with that kind of respect," I continued. "But first, you'd have to understand what you took from me, not just the recipes, but the story, the legacy, the connection to something bigger than yourself." "I do understand now," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Carmen. I'm so sorry." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I know you are, mija. And you know what? There might be a place for you here, not as a partner, not as an equal, but as someone learning to respect the traditions you tried to steal." Her eyes lit up with hope. "But," I continued, "it would mean acknowledging publicly what you did. It would mean helping me tell the real story of these recipes, even if it's embarrassing for you. It would mean working your way up from the bottom, learning not just how to cook, but why we cook." She nodded eagerly. Yes, I'll do anything." And it would mean that Antonio understands that this isn't just about business. This is about family and respect and understanding that some things are more important than profit. I'll talk to him. I'll make him understand. That was 6 months ago. Isabella closed Corazon Mexicano and came to work at Abuela Rosa's kitchen as a prep cook. She's slowly working her way up, learning not just my recipes, but the stories behind them, the techniques that can't be written down, the patience and respect that real cooking requires. Antonio was furious at first, but he's slowly coming around. He sees that his wife is learning something she never understood before, that authenticity can't be faked, and that some things are worth more than money. Isabella still has a long way to go. Some of my family members think I was too generous, that I should have let her restaurant fail completely without offering her a second chance. But my grandmother always taught me that the most powerful revenge is showing someone a better way to live. Today, Abuela Rosa's Kitchen is the most successful Mexican restaurant in our neighborhood. We've been featured in 3 major food magazines, and we're booked weeks in advance for weekend dinners. But more importantly, the real story of my family's recipes is being told. People know about my grandmother Rosa, about the techniques she brought from Mexico, about the love and care that went into perfecting each dish over generations. The recipe cards are still on display, right where customers can see them. The photos of my grandmother are on the walls. The wooden spoon she used for 50 years sits in a place of honor behind the register. And every dish that goes out tells its true story, not some fiction about mysterious indigenous grandmothers, but the real story of real people who preserved these traditions through love, sacrifice, and an understanding that food is about more than just feeding people. Isabella learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it. And me? I learned that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't revenge. It's showing the world what authentic really looks like. My grandmother would be proud, not just of the restaurant, but of the fact that her great-granddaughter-in-law is finally learning to cook with respect for the traditions she tried to steal. Some stories end with the villain getting their comeuppance. This one ends with everyone learning to do better. And honestly, that feels like a much sweeter victory than simple revenge ever could have been. But I'll tell you one thing. Nobody's ever going to steal my family's recipes again without understanding exactly what they're taking and what it means to the people who created them. Because now everyone knows, when it comes to authentic Mexican food, there's only one place in town where you can taste the real story, and it's not the place that tried to erase the woman who made it all possible. What do you think? Would you have been as generous as Carmen, or would you have let Isabella's restaurant fail completely? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing what you all think about these family drama situations.